Months ago. I don't know how you do this. I don't do it. Like it's really just hard alone.
Who can relate? Still haven't graded your exams. I will get there, I promise.
So that was like recently submitted. Like
That's true.
we haven't gotten separated from like 2-3 months ago.
Oh, wow.
I don't think we have. You know, I had a teacher who, or actually I had a couple of teachers who didn't even once started grade. I didn't even know what my grade was to the end of the semester.
Oh, that's annoying.
It was for the West classes, but it really pisses me off because I'm like, okay, this still counts for my degree. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I tried to do a week. It just didn't happen this time with your exams. Just stuff comes up. It's so I work a lot with Chesapeake Bay Academy. And one of their teachers actually passed away over the weekend. So, and like they knew she had breast cancer, but like it's still really hard.
It's both.
Yeah, yeah,
My sister goes to North Legion and it's only about that.
yeah, and so, like I spent time yesterday just like coming up with resources for the school, you know, with Dr. Roberts from EVMS. So, you know, and I'm glad to do that, but it also just means that time I was gonna grade didn't happen, so. Yeah, she worked till Friday is my understanding, so. And like the kids knew she was really open with them, but that still doesn't make it easier. And if you're not familiar with CBA, they're all kids with learning differences. And so like, not everybody, but a big chunk of them are neurodivergent, right? Somewhere on the spectrum. And so like, sometimes it's hard for them to process things. So we were trying to give them tips for that too.
Well, then she did, our teacher.
Yeah, which like, that's one thing that Dr. Roberts, who's our therapist from EVMS and I were talking about, is usually everybody loves the art teacher, right? So like that makes it extra tough. So yeah, for folks who just came in or folks on Zoom, I was just talking about why I didn't get your exams graded. It's not the best excuse, but I work a lot with CBA, Chesapeake Bay Academy, and one of their teachers passed away over the weekend. So we've been trying to support them. But I promise I will get to these. I hate being that person who just like has them for weeks, so. Okie dokie, so today we're gonna start talking about learning theory. I am mostly trained in this, and so I will fully recognize I will have some inherent bias, but I'll also try to be really clear about the weaknesses here as well. So sometimes you'll just hear this called learning theory, sometimes you'll hear it called social learning theory, sometimes you'll hear it called cognitive social learning theory. So I just titled it all forward, right? Just since it's there. And the idea is cognitive social learning theory really influenced a lot of modern therapies. And so we'll talk about those as well as we go through. So these theories are really about the intersection of learning theory, which we're going to do a very brief reminder of learning theory, information processing, so a lot of the stuff that came from cognitive psychology, particularly in the 60s and 70s, in terms of how humans computate, deal with, analyze, respond to information that we get from our senses. Social psychology comes into play here, particularly as we think about how people relate to one another. Behavioral therapy, but also experimental psychology. So this, I guess the trait theory just as much, but those two are really the two that are most grounded in sort of modern psychological science. And let's find things that are empirically supported. All right, so the key feature, well, there's several key features, but the first one we're going to start with is the APBC model. And what we'll see is, as we go through the evolution of this theory, we'll see these letters kind of used in different ways, interchanged in different ways. But essentially what we're looking at is A is the antecedent. The antecedent can be a situation, it can be another person, it can be something that was said to you, it can be a task you have to do. It's what came before. And the P is a big thing that brings this into the realm of personality psychology. The person. What brings the person to the situation and what the person brings to the situation. So how are we interpreting the situation? How are we influencing the situation? Some models prior to this sort of ignored how people influence the situation, and that's a really important component here. Behavior, the things that we do. And then consequences, and those can be internal consequences like depression, but also things like physical issues, right? Stomach ulcers, things like high blood pressure, but also external consequences as well. How are we influencing those around us and the environment around us? So as I mentioned, we're going to see lots of variations of this sort of ABC with a P thrown in throughout our lecture. Key feature 2, as I just emphasized a couple slides ago, is that it is based on an experimental approach. This theory has an insistence on validating evidence. They want to have really clear syntax of how do these things relate to one another. They come up with testable hypotheses. And then there's a lot of attention paid to semantics. So what are we calling things? And operationalism, so operational definitions. What do things mean? How does that mean that they act? This is really important for this particular model. And this is one of the things that makes this model unique, particularly compared to some of the earlier models we talked about, like psychodynamic. The third key feature is the importance of cognition, of thought and our thought processes. So people are seen as active information processors. We're not just passive. We take in information and we do something with it. So we encode the information. We get it into our memory. We store it. Our memory has the ability to keep information. And then one of the most important things is we need to be able to retrieve it, right? Get it out of storage. If you have a big storage, but you don't have a way to get in there to get out your memories, right? It doesn't do you very much good. And then we want to apply. And basically, this is learning from your past, right? Remembering what you've been through and applying that to future situations. And this differs from radical behaviorism. So radical behaviorism really just emphasized the only thing that matters is what we can see. So what an animal does, what a person does. In order to understand this difference, we're going to go over what radical behaviorism actually believes first by reviewing learning theories. And so there are several different ways that we can learn. And learning theorists believe that all of human behavior is learned. I would say that most modern psychologists kind of come down on genes are expressed in an environment that you both learn and you have some stuff sort of programmed in from your genes. But pure radical behaviorists were like, no, you're a blank slate when you're born and you learn everything. So habituation is getting used to a stimulus such that you no longer respond to it in the same way. And this can be maintained only if a stimulus changes or increases with each reputation. So for example, I wear my Fitbit all the time, right? I don't notice I'm wearing it, right? If I had to pay attention to the fact that my Fitbit is on my wrist all the time, I might have a hard time paying attention to other things. Another example is car alarms. So when car alarms first came out, yes, I was alive when car alarms first came out. I'm ancient. everyone noticed if one came off, right? Everyone was like, what's happening? Who's going? Like, you know, I remember around the time they started to become popular, a woman on the radio telling a story that she was like held at gunpoint and she threw her car keys so that the guy couldn't drive off with her in the car. And she hit another car and the alarm went off and the guy took off. And so like it double saved her. Nowadays, what happens if a car alarm goes off? Yeah, no one cares. We all ignore it. We all just assume someone sat on the button, right? I remember even when I was in college, a friend just jokingly yelling, "Stop stealing cars!" when someone's alarm went off. Yeah, and so we get habituated to these things, and this can be really dangerous. Was it this class where we were talking about the fire alarm, or was that my intro class? Might have been my intro class. So we had a real problem, and I guess it happens sometimes here too, with people pulling the fire alarm in the middle of the night because they thought it was funny. This is not funny. I think it's actually like technically a federal offense. And what happens, if this happens a lot, is people habituate even to the loud fire alarm noise and they sleep through it. So I was an RA and my job was to actually go like pound on people's doors and make sure they got up when the fire alarm went off, because you never know if it's an actual fire, right? So dangerous. Habituation can be good or it can be dangerous. All right, so classical conditioning. You may remember this from intro psych. The basic idea is that you have some sort of unconditioned stimulus, like food, and that's going to elicit an unconditioned response. So you don't have to teach anyone or anything that this is a good thing or elicit a response. So the prime example here is you give food to a dog, you show food to a dog, they start drooling, right? And there's actually a biological reason the saliva helps start breaking down the food. Then what you do is you pair that unconditioned stimulus with a conditioned stimulus, one you want the dog or the person to learn. In the case of the classic Pavlov experiment, he paired it with a bell, for example. And so every time you give the dog food, you also ring the bell. So the dog then associates the food with the bell. And eventually, it's so conditioned that if you just ring the bell and you don't give the dog food yet, the dog will still start drooling. And so now that unconditioned response is also a conditioned response to the bell. So it's really based on contingencies. It's the perception that one stimulus predicts the other, right? So cat food now, a lot of times dog food has like the pull top. But it used to be you had to like get out your can opener, right? And people who had the electric can openers that kind of made like a right? Dogs would recognize that and come running because they knew that means food, right? Or dogs or cats will come running if you shake their bag of treats, right? Because they know that sound means yum. So I have a little fun video that
Pavlov
did here. This is a reenactment because Pavlov was doing this in the early 1900s, so there weren't really, this quality of video.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps, he thought, the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
He's speaking Russian.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes Before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues, the dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome.
A couple quick things here. He did it with a whole bunch of different things. We usually think about the bell, but he actually started with a metronome, and you'll see some of the other things he used as well. Couple other fun side notes. So as you see, Pavlos was really interested in the salivation reflex. He was interested in digestion. He was not actually a psychology researcher. This is just something he stumbled upon. And one thing that this video misses that's part of that is that how he kind of started picking up on this is the dogs grew to recognize the footsteps of the researchers who were going to feed them, and they started drooling when they heard those footsteps.
At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon the sound
I love it. That's like a little observation hole for the experimenter, and the dog's like, I know you're back there.
alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Полная! Идите сюда. Что я говорил?
He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Собака.
Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the
So yeah, this is one way that animals and people learn, is that we learn by these associations. Oops, I did not mean to stop sharing. Okay, there we go. So how does this relate to personality? And I'm going to show another video in a minute, so I'm just going to leave the lights off for a sec. And it has to do with these stimulus response associations. The idea here is that everything is stimulus response to an environmental stimuli, whether that's hearing footsteps, lights, what have you. And so they said that the patterns were also idiosyncratic. That means everyone kind of develops their own patterns for these things. This idea does still have influence today. So Dollard and Miller were learning theorists who took an extremely scientific response, and they were very concerned about internal processing. So they said, how do you account for really complicated reactions that we have? And they assumed that the processes inside the head followed the same stimulus response laws as things you can see, like the dog drooling. So they said something elicits, some stimulus elicits a response in our brain, and then there's a chain of responses inside our brain. And the external stimulus elicits a chain of these small response, stimulus, response, stimulus, response, stimulus, until you get the behavioral response that we can observe. So operant conditioning sort of said, okay, classical conditioning makes sense, but that doesn't explain everything on learning. And so Skinner was one of the big names here, and this looked at the likelihood of a response is either increased or decreased by virtue of its consequences. So you're gonna do something or not do something, depending on what happens to you after you do it. And so there are both reinforcement and punishment, and there are both positive and negative versions of each of those. So reinforcement is used to get the behavior to occur more frequently by rewarding the behavior. So you're trying, with reinforcement, you're trying to increase the likelihood the behavior will happen. Positive reinforcement is what we typically think of when we think of reinforcement. This is where you give something desirable to make a behavior occur more often. Classic example of this is dog training. They sit, you give them a treat, right? They go potty, you give them a treat, right? Positive reinforcement. It can also be something like your kiddo's nice to their sibling, so maybe you give them a piece of candy every time they do that. That could go awry. There's also negative reinforcement, and negative reinforcement is the idea of taking something undesirable away. So positive here is not like positive in the way we think of it, like, oh, it's a good thing. Positive means you're adding something that wasn't there before. Negative means you're taking something away, you're subtracting something. So for negative reinforcement, you're going to take something undesirable away to get the behavior to occur more often. So an example of this is, again, let's say your kid is nice to their sibling, rather than like giving them cavities with all the candy, you might be like, oh, you were so nice to your sibling, you don't have to wash the dishes tonight. You don't have to do whatever chore you don't like doing. This can really go into like psychopathology too, on human behavior. So let's say you get attacked on a dark street, right? Well, what you might start doing is avoiding that particular street, avoiding being out at night. And that will take away that fear, that negative anxiety response that you had. And so the avoidance behavior is reinforced by not having those negative feelings. So it's negatively reinforced, and then it becomes more frequent. And so for some people, it might start with like the street where they got mugged, and then it might generalize to like not being out at night at all, right? And then it starts to limit your life a little bit. So you can think in terms, again, of positive is always giving something to the person to modify their behavior, and negative is always taking something away. Punishment is used in order to get a behavior to occur less often. So punishment, you're getting a behavior to occur less often by punishing it. Positive punishment sounds like an oxymoron, right? Until you think of it as we're adding something they don't want to get a behavior to occur less often. Yeah.
Do you have the chart for that? Because that's how I remembered it.
The chart?
Yeah.
Yeah, I could draw it actually. Here, let me turn the light back on so y'all can see it. Yeah. That's often how I do it as well. So you can draw this as a chart. So where you think of positive and negative, and reinforcement and punishment. Okay, so what you're doing in reinforcement is you're adding something, something they want to increase the behavior, get it to occur more often. BX just means behavior. For this, you're going to take away something they don't want for negative reinforcement to get behavior to occur more often. And then in terms of punishment, you're going to give them something they don't want for positive punishment to decrease the frequency of the behavior. And then for a negative punishment, you're going to take away something they want to decrease the frequency of the behavior. And hopefully folks on Zoom can see that as well. So yeah, the chart helps me too. So thanks for bringing that up. I often draw it. So positive punishment is where you give something undesirable to try to get the behavior to stop or occur less often. So spanking, We do not recommend, right? We know that there are negative psychological consequences, but this is an example of positive punishment. Giving someone lines in school, right? I will not do this. I will not do this. That's a positive punishment. Negative punishment is where you take away something desirable, something they want, to make a behavior occur less often. So you have their kiddo, and instead of being nice to their sibling, they hit their sibling. Okay, no TV tonight. So essentially, the idea related to personality here is that both punishment and reinforcement are going to influence how we behave. And I have another quick video here looking at Skinner. So this is a pigeon in a Skinner box doing a research study.
Can pigeons read? This one gives every indication, because he's been taught to distinguish between two words and to behave appropriately. He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment. The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behavior and see how that could be changed. Skinner did this by keeping individual pigeons at about 3/4 of their normal weight, so that the birds were always hungry, and food could be used as an automatic reward. The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behavior, pecking a colored disc, was measured on a graph. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behavior of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered, or in Skinner's terms, what was the schedule of reinforcement.
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement is what the layman calls reward, and you can schedule it so that a reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something. We usually use a response with a pigeon pecking a little disc, a little spot in the wall, and you can reinforce with food, but you don't reinforce every time. Perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that. There are a very large number of schedules, and they have their special effects. And there is a good example of how you can move from the pigeon to the human case, because one of the schedules which is very effective with rats or pigeons is what we call the variable ratio schedule, and that is at the heart of all gambling devices, and has the same effect. The pigeon can become a pathological gambler just as a person can. Now, the fact that we found that out with pigeons and could prove it by removing and changing the schedule makes it easy for us to interpret the case with the human subject. We don't say that the human subject gambles to punish himself, as the Freudians might say, or gambles because he feels excited when he does so. Nothing of the sort. People gamble because of the schedule of the reinforcement that follows. And this is true of all gambling systems. They all have variable ratios built into them. So what we've learned from the pigeon, it made it possible to interpret this vast field very effectively.
Where does that leave free will? Because we all think we have a choice whether to do things or not to do things.
Yes. Well, you see, it leaves it in the position of a fiction. We have assumed somehow or other that these internal states, feelings, and so on, have initiated something. They have started something. They have created. We have done something in a voluntary way. We have willed to act. If you now look at the actual history, we find that there are external reasons why this has happened. In other words, by discovering the causes of behavior, we can dispose of the imagined internal cause. We dispose of free will as an American divine of the 18th century, Jonathan Edwards, did. He said, we believe in free will because we know about our behavior, but not about its causes. And of course, it's the object of a science of behavior to discover causes. And once you have found those causes, there is less you need to attribute to an internal act of will, and eventually, I think you need to attribute nothing to it.
So as you can see, Skinner had sort of an extreme idea about this stuff. He truly believed, hang on, there we go. that what happened in the mind didn't matter. He called the mind a black box. He said, doesn't matter what we think or what we feel, it's just the stimulus response, stimulus response. Pretty much everyone else in this theory we're going to talk about disagrees with him. But it is sort of an interesting, like, he is the true radical behaviorist, that like what we think, what we feel doesn't matter, and we don't have free will. Everyone else would kind of disagree. So Skinner's version of the ABC model here was the antecedent, what happens in the environment, and then you do a behavior, how the organism reacted, and the consequences. In this case, if we're thinking about the pigeon, them getting rewarded, or we think about, I like the example they use of, the gambler, right? They're going to get rewarded every once in a while, so they're just going to keep going until they get a reward. So the person did not matter to Skinner, right? It was what was going on outside. So he would do what's called a functional analysis, where you would look at these ABCs to figure out, again, what he was saying at the end of that video, what historically is causing your behavior. For example, to find out about something like ADHD, you would get the idea, observe the behavior in context, and observe how others react to consequences. And there are some elements in this to even how we interpret modern things today. So for example, we know one of the reasons why the impulsive behaviors in ADHD, the hyperactivity, is perpetuated is because it's often unintentionally positively reinforced, right? Because even if you yell at a kid for like, stop curving in your seat, to the kid, they're still getting attention, right? And so that can be reinforcing in and of itself unintentionally. So again, the later people will talk about added the P and said you do need to understand the person's motive and what they bring to the situation, but Skinner would have poo-pooed that idea. So that brings us to observational learning. And this is the set of processes by which we look at the behavior of one person, the observer, changes as a function of exposure to the behavior of another person, the model. So we might not be being reinforced or conditioned personally, but by watching other people, we might pick up on their behavior and copy it. So the effects are imitation or copying. But can also be things like facilitation, learning rules, learning how to do things by watching others. The big name here is Albert Bandura. This is a picture of him down in the corner. And he looked at different types or forms of modeling. So live, or watching a person actually do it. Symbolic, so having it on TV. And in fact, he would sort of dress the model in like a cartoon-like costume to try to like make it seem like you're watching a cartoon instead of a person. And then imaginal, where you can literally have someone imagine someone else doing the activity in their mind and learn from that. And so some of you may have seen this video before, but it's a classic. I always got to show it. This is Bobo Dolls.
The segment you're about to see is taken from an early experiment on learning of aggressive styles of behavior through modeling. Children watched a filmed adult perform novel aggressive acts toward a inflated doll, and the physical aggression was accompanied by novel hostile remarks. We later measured how much of this modeled aggression the children had learned just by watching. Now, the measurement of learning of aggression uses simulated targets rather than live ones. For example, to test how well bombardiers have learned bombing strategies, you would use simulated targets rather than require them to bomb San Francisco or New York. The model pummeled the doll with a mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, threw it down and beat it.
So these were the kids after watching the adult do it.
It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language.
The novel hostile language or something like, you stupid, blah, 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 I'm gonna get you. And importantly here, it wasn't just the boys that picked up on it.
The room contained varied play materials, and children could choose to play aggressively or non-aggressively.
So you can't see, she just threw a ball at its head.
The children devised new ways of hitting the doll. Now, the object of interest was the novel aggressive acts, not punching the doll. And children in the control
Right, and
group
took
who
us-
had no exposure to the aggressive modeling never exhibited the novel forms of aggression. And here's a creative embellishment. A doll becomes a weapon of assault.
All right. So reactions to that. What are your gut reactions? What do you think when you watch that? What does it make you think of? Where do children see violence models? Let's put it that way.
From the parent.
From their parents, certainly. Yeah, where else? Video games, yeah. Cartoons, right? So when I was growing up, like Looney Tunes was still on, right? And like, oh, it's so cute when the Roadrunner drops an anvil on a coyote, right? And so, Bandura wasn't arguing that like all violence comes from watching these types of things, but he did say we need to be careful about it, right? We need to think about it. He also talked about how we can harness these things for good, which I'll talk about in a second. And so there were three phases: the exposure, actually watching the model, and then attention. You have to pay attention to the model through acquisition. So you're paying attention, you're encoding it, you're retaining it. You're using those cognitive processes to absorb and take in and process what you're watching, right? And then acceptance. as measured by performance. So the kids really accepted that the adult's behavior was okay because no one told them it wasn't, right? And so Bandura and Walters did a classic study looking at modeling with therapy. And so they developed the participant modeling form of exposure therapy. And so exposure therapy is when someone with a phobia or other things such as PTSD is exposed to what they fear in a safe environment. And by going through a series of tasks, essentially it reduces their fear by exposing them to it. And so the participant modeling form was used in particular in his original study to treat people with snake phobias. So they watched the others, typically the therapists, interact with the snake. And then there was participant modeling and guided participation, where the model, the therapist, would guide them to do the same behavior that their therapist was doing in a graduated fashion. With this, you don't start with, especially with sort of this graded version. You don't start with walk in the room and pick up the snake, right? You might like watch from across the room and move your way up, and maybe you just touch it, right? And then eventually you're holding it. And this is called systematic desensitization, where you break it into these steps. They also gave them encouragement, which is reinforcing, right? Telling them it's okay, you're doing great, encouraging them. And the participants, the therapy patients were able to do it themselves over time. Participant modeling worked very well. It increased their ability to interact with their snakes, and also the self-efficacy of the participants, their ability to believe they could do it, increased by watching somebody else do it. Now, side funny note about this. So when I was in this class, when I was an undergrad, like the idea of PDFs online were really just starting to happen. And so a lot of times if we had to read an article, it would be put on interlibrary loan in the library. And so I went to get this article, the Bandura and Walters article, and I'm reading it in the, and there, with any study, you're going to have participants who just stop participating. Typically, they just like, especially this was a longer one, life changes, things like that. And so someone had written in the part about the participant dropout, like, the snakes got them. I was like, no, that's not what happened, but obviously still funny. So Bandura expanded this. So I got to see him a few years back at a conference. And he talked about all of the ways he's applied this idea. He also talked about the fact that, like, I think he's since passed, but at that time he would like get recognized by people who had taken intro psych, and he would like get room upgrades, like, you're the photo guy. But what he did is he took this idea and he applied it to social problems. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly places where TV isn't readily available, at the time he was doing this, there was a lot of radio programming and radio soap operas and that thing. So in one of these radio soap operas, they made a character who was HIV positive. And they sort of surveyed the public, and what they found is after this character was introduced, because the other characters on the show were supportive and accepting, the overall acceptance of the population went up too. Did the same thing in Mexico with telenovelas, and looked at having a gay character. And again, because the other characters accepted it, acceptance went up. So just subtle ways that we can start to change and shape people's attitudes. Really interesting. And so what Bandura was really doing was building on operant conditioning, right? Building on this idea of reinforcement. So Skinner would describe it by the top model, right? He would say, okay, so you have the modeling stimulus, the person doing it, right? And the observer's response will then itself be reinforced, which means the observer will keep doing it. Individuals see an antecedent, hear the model, they would behave, their response, and get reinforced their consequence. But when you start to look at this from observational learning, from the larger cognitive social learning theory, it gets a little more complicated. So you anticipate that there will be a reinforcement just by the nature that another person is there. So you're going to pay attention to that model because you're like, oh, I want to see what happens. So you still have the modeling stimuli. You watch that person do whatever the task is, but you respond in a much more complex way. Symbolic coding, you encode things into your brain, cognitive organization, and rehearsal. You rehearse things mentally by watching and maybe behaviorally with the model. So I think about like, if you've ever done like a Zumba class or any other kind of a yoga or exercise class, right? You kind of watch the instructor and then you come in. Same type of idea. And then you get reinforced. And there's a cognitive component here that's distinct from Skinner's theory. The observer is thinking. And again, Skinner would not have acknowledged this, or if he acknowledged it, he wouldn't have cared. Who cares if they're thinking? I don't think I care about his observable behavior. But Bandura was really interested in these cognitive processes. What do you see when you're watching a video or you're watching someone live in front of you? What do you take away from it? What do you extract from it? And how do you use that information in the future? And efficacy expectations are a big part of why this works. And there are 4 basic types of mechanisms. The first is performance accomplishment. So this is the ability to carry out the task yourself, to do it yourself, is a reward in and of itself. So when you do something well, you feel good about it, right? So by changing your performance, you can change behavior. So those of you who are athletes, think about when you gained a new skill or you did something really well or you got a new time in a race, right? Those are performance accomplishments and they're inherently rewarding. Then there's vicarious experience with the live or symbolic modeling. By watching it happen to the model, you're vicariously rewarded. And the best example here is watching sports. People get so invested in how their teams do, right? You're not doing anything. You're often just sitting on the couch, right? But you feel really good if your team wins. And people will say like, we won. It's like, cool, what'd you do, right? But we feel invested. Verbal persuasion is suggestion, instruction, or interpretations, often by the model. And then emotional arousal is attribution, the systematic desensitization, realizing that snake isn't going to hurt you. And the symbolic exposure. Those are interesting. We pay attention, we get something, we feel something as a result. And these all work by changing efficacy expectations. I will be able to do this. Rather than, no way in hell I can do that. I can't touch that snake, right? Quick story in our last minute here. My graduate advisor, who's one of the people I look up most to in my life, told us this funny story that when she was in grad school, they had a snake to use for snake therapy, snake phobia therapy. And they said, oh, Jan, it's your turn to work with this patient. And she said, I can't. And they said, well, why not? She said, I'm afraid of the snake. And so then they made her do it so that she could get over her fear. But yeah, it's something that even as therapists, we have to work on. Okay, awesome. We will keep talking about this on Friday.